Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Safe and Safe Country, where we speak about different aspects of security and defense. How does it influence our daily life, and when and how Ukraine will wield this war? My name is Elena Frolova, and I'm a host and author of this podcast, which I do jointly with the Center for Defense Strategy, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. And you can follow our podcast and follow us at the biggest podcast platforms, Google, Apple, Spotify, and of course at the resources of Ukrainska Pravda. Our today talk will be dedicated to the support of UK, one of our biggest supporters in this war, to the changing in politics of European Union, and to consideration about tactics and operational field of this war. Welcome. So today is not very usual podcast because we decided to make it together with Sevgil, who is the chief.
Nice to meet you all.
Who is the chief editor of Ukrainska Pravda, and we will speak to our guests from UK who came here with a visit, who are representative of academias, different universities, and who are working over the international politics and war studies. And our guest today is Sir Hugh Strong, Professor of International Relations at University of St. Andrews. And Sir Strong is advisor to the Parliamentary Committee on Defense in the Parliament of the Great Britain. He was advising for some years to different bodies, including MOD or General Staff, and you will speak more about this. And so he is a well-known historian on the war studies. And the second guest is Stephen Gethins, Professor of Practice at the School of International Affairs and former member of the Parliament. And we will speak about UK, we will speak about the international relations and what Ukraine can do to make support sustainable and what Ukraine should do to make the peace sustainable. Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
First of all, we are close to the 1 year of, I cannot say that this is a celebration, but this is 1 year of prominent event. The first leader of the democratic world came to the Ukraine in the beginning of the war, and this first leader was Boris Johnson. He is very popular here, and UK is very popular because of all the support which UK is giving. And why you're here? What's the aim of your visit here?
If I'm not mistaken, this is your first visit.
This is my first visit, indeed, first visit to Ukraine. And indeed, when the war broke out and I found I was being asked to comment, I said, I have no expertise in relation to Ukraine. I'm really not qualified to speak about this. And people said to me, but you know about war, sadly. My wife says, of course, I should work on peace rather than on war, but you know about war. And that has proved to be the case, that in the end, there is enough here that I recognize, enough here from which I'm learning. I find myself engaged, not just because so many people around the world are engaged for all the right reasons, motivated by Ukraine's struggle, but also because this is my subject matter, and therefore I find myself drawn into it.
And coming to your subject matter, is this war somehow different from the previous wars which we have? The First World War, the Second World War? What's the difference?
Well, not as different as we might hope it might have been and would have been. I mean, I think for somebody who works in war studies, if you look at the projections the 3 or 4 years before the Russian invasion, not before 2014, but let's say between 2014 and 2022, in the United Kingdom, 2014 was the year in which effectively we withdrew from active operations in Afghanistan, for example. If you look at that period, then there were two strong expectations driven very largely by, I think, over-optimism about where war was going. One was an argument that actually, and this is an argument developed by an American, Steven Pinker, that loss of life in violence, and particularly loss of life in war, was declining. I find very little evidence that that is true. And the reason I find very little evidence that that is true is we don't actually have a very good handle on the scale of loss of life in proportion to population in previous centuries. We have a reasonable handle for the 20th century, but even there it's not very accurate. And secondly, it doesn't allow for the fact that, particularly in operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, from the point of view of the coalition forces in each case, not necessarily from the point of view of the populations of Iraq and Afghanistan, many, many more people proportionately were wounded and survived those wounds than were killed. So, for example, in the First World War, roughly 1 in 3, the ratio was 1 to 3 of those killed and wounded. In Afghanistan for UK forces, it was about 1 to 8. In other words, 8 of those people, probably 6 or 7 of them, would have had injuries so catastrophic in the First World War that they would have died. So, these comparisons are not very helpful. And there are all sorts of people who are left out of the accounts in terms of the way in which those statistics are done. What we're learning, of course, is war is lethal enough, and Ukraine knows that only too well. The second argument that was developed and is still part of the ongoing debate is this notion that there's something called cyber war. And I think what that confuses is the use of cyber in war, which Ukraine knows all about, and the use of cyber as a substitute for war. These are very different things. And if you think that, for example, major state actors, and in the current context, Russia, is going to wage war simply through cyberspace, then the relatively good news in that is that's not going to be so lethal. These arguments start being congruent because you're getting a case to say, actually, if you cause chaos in digital communications, in IT terms, as Estonia experienced, for example, there may be 1 or 2 people die or suffer as an indirect consequence of that, but the use of cyber is itself not directly lethal. The use of artillery, the use of small arms fire, bombing, all that's lethal. And so if it were genuinely the case that states were going to compete solely in cyberspace, then this would reinforce the Steven Pinker argument. We'd be going in a more positive direction. The reality is that cyber is very important in 21st century warfare, but it's there as an enabler. It enables more effective targeting. It enables more effective acquisition of targets. It enables better communications between those actually in the field. Ukraine knows all this because it's doing all this and doing it very effectively. But you still go back to the core principle, which is that war is violent, nasty, brutish, lethal in its effects. And the point here is, and it's been regularly referenced both in Ukraine and in commentaries in Britain, for example, much of what is happening now on the front lines looks like the First World War. I think there are limitations in that argument. No war looks exactly like the previous war. But the very fact that artillery is so important, that you have Ukrainians in trench positions, field fortifications, and so on, all these things smack as much of 1914-18 as they smack of 2023.
Do you trust the level of evaluation of the Ukrainian armed forces, of the losses for Russian armed forces? Does it look realistic? Because there are many arguments about this.
I have no reason to distrust the evaluation of casualties. I mean, I think one of the things I find very hard to get a firm grasp on, because neither side wishes to be open about its level of casualties, is what the actual balance is. I mean, I have found some of the Ukrainian figures very hard to believe. I can't believe that actually, sadly, that your death and wounded rates aren't much higher than have sometimes figured in the discussion, particularly in the early stages of the war. I'm not so surprised by the Russian levels, which have been put very high. And I talked to 1 or 2 people who try and get a better sense of what those loss levels are. But the short answer is the tendency, naturally enough, in a country like Britain, is to trust what Ukraine says about Russian figures. But then we don't actually have openness on the Ukrainian side. So we don't quite know what the comparative levels are. People will say, and I get very frustrated about this, that in order to attack, you need a 3-to-1 superiority. There's almost no point in history when actually an attacker has had a 3-to-1 superiority, at least in absolute terms. You might get a local superiority of 3-1, where an aggressor manages to concentrate his forces on one particular point. But you will never, or extraordinarily rarely, have that degree of superiority. But if you do concentrate 3-1 superiority and you are attacking, in other words, you're exposing yourself by advancing, then the normal expectation also is that loss levels of the attacker will be higher than the loss levels of the defender. And again, the evidence, if you go back to the First World War, is that that's not actually true. In most of the battles on the Western Front in the First World War, the loss levels, whether you were attacking or defending, were roughly the same for both sides. And these were predominantly artillery battles, much like we're seeing at the moment. So I don't have an answer to that question. And one of the problems of being a historian with a war going on at the moment is the very easy position for a historian in that situation is to say, I'll tell you in 50 years' time. I won't be able to tell you because I'll be dead by then. But, we haven't got the evidence. And even if we did have the evidence, we don't know how reliable it will be. So as a First World War historian, I can give you what is meant to be a rough approximation of the military dead, total military dead of the First World War, which is between 8 million and 10 million. That's a big variation. It's 2 million difference. That's for all belligerents. We have no idea, absolutely no idea of the civilian death rate in the First World War. We also don't know whether that figure includes the dead in the conflicts after 1918, before the final peace treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Some people have put those loss levels at 4 million. That's half as much again as the original 8 million. For the Second World War, when I began my career as a military historian, the total death rates across all belligerents were something like 45 million. We're now up to a figure of roughly 65 million. Where did those 20 million come from? Or where were they when they were first counting? So even a conflict about which we think we know a great deal with a considerable distance in time since it occurred, we don't know what the numbers are.
So we live in circumstances of full-scale war already more than a year. And we jump from the strategy of Russia, Kiev for 3 days, to long war. Do you see how Russia changed her strategy and how they will change the strategy in future?
I think, I hasten to add, I was not one of those that immediately thought Russia was going to be enormously powerful, that it'd be a short war and quickly successful, because I realized perfectly well that a country the size of Ukraine, with the population that was mobilized, would put up a significant defense, and that although I had never been to Ukraine, that the complexities of operating with a comparatively small army in relation to the size of Ukraine would make it difficult. What I had assumed was that Russian command and control would be far better than it was. I could not understand how you had a maneuver that had convergent armies coming in from different points of the compass, which looks very good on the map, could actually be implemented, particularly when you had no clear theatre commander in charge of the operation. And instead you had a series of independent, uncoordinated operations. And to some extent, it still feels like that, even though General Gerasimov is meant to be in overall control. It still feels as though this is not a campaign that has a competent commander on the Russian side. Of course, we've understood this campaign, for those of us looking at it from the outside, in terms of two strong personalities. I mean, your president, who is absolutely the public face of Ukraine, and Putin as the public face of Russia. And to that extent, for recent observers of armed conflict, it's striking how, in terms of the public perception, the military commanders have a very low profile. If you're used to Americans fighting, whether it's Stan McChrystal or in Afghanistan or Dave Petraeus in the United States, or go back a generation or two to Eisenhower or Patton, the general is a big public figure. What's interesting in these campaigns is if you went onto the streets of the United Kingdom, you might do better in Ukraine, and asked them to name one Ukrainian commander or one Russian commander, they would struggle to do so.
Really? Because we absolutely sure in Ukraine everyone knows Zaluzhny, or I don't know, in Poland everyone knows Zaluzhny.
Absolutely. Those of us who are interested in following the campaign certainly know Zaluzhny. But what I'm saying is that in terms of public statements, President Zelensky is the figure. And therefore, but perhaps more importantly, in the Russian case, who is actually running this campaign? The suggestion is that Putin's own hand is one of the main causes of political incompetence. In other words, any professional soldier would not have launched a Russian campaign in the way in which it was launched, and that subsequently there has been enough interference on the Russian side to confound the command. One of the points as a 20th century military historian, am I a 20th century? Yes, I am a 20th century military historian, is that Russia is given the credit in the 1930s, not a good time to talk about Russia and Ukraine, but Russia is given the credit for developing what is called the operational level of war. They knew how to mount major operations using mass armies in an era of industrialized war. Their capacity to do that was hit by the purges because senior commanders went, but it was recovered in the latter stages of the Second World War. And at any point during the Cold War, when NATO looked at the Soviet army, then they assessed pretty favorably and positively what the Soviet army was meant to be able to do when it came to the conduct of major operations, using artillery, armor, all the things that we're seeing on the ground at the moment. And they absolutely have not delivered on that.
Stephen, if we say about the tactics or, I don't know, strategy of Russia in this war, but using this like a constant chantage tactic, always grains, always tactical nuclear weapons. Now they said that they will place the weapons, nuclear weapons, in Belarus. And Ukraine, actually, and Ukrainians, and we have polls about this, they do not afraid. I mean, it was a polling which said that 86% of Ukrainians said that even if a nuclear tactical weapon will be used in Ukraine, we should not sit down on the table for negotiations with the Russians. But the perception of Europe and perception of other countries are a little bit different or drastically different. What do you think about this, and how you see the situation from like international relations point of view, from UK, from European Union?
I should explain, I'm not a military historian. I don't have the same depth of knowledge as Hugh's just illustrated to us in this podcast, and your listeners will be benefiting from that. From an international relations perspective, I mean, there's obviously fear around the deployment of nuclear weapons, because I think one thing that's always worth remembering is that Ukrainians are living with this war day and daily. They're following it. And then the challenge is, and it is a challenge, and this is one of the reasons why we're in Ukraine today we're here in Eastern Europe, and we come from the far west of Europe. And one of the reasons we're here is to continue to raise awareness of this war, and that's a challenge for all of us who consider ourselves friends of Ukraine. On the nuclear issue, I can see why Ukrainians aren't afraid of this, because if we look at what Russia's done to your country over the past year, building on what they'd already done to your country over the past 8 or 9 years, and then you look back in history with the Holodomor, with this era of living history for you. This isn't something that's ancient history for people in Ukraine. The eras of the 1930s and what happened since, and what happened in Crimea and elsewhere is living history. So I can see why you're not afraid of this. The Russians keep on threatening this. Now, if Russia were to deploy nuclear weapons, how much more damage are they doing? Ukrainians will continue to fight, because one of the things is that, as the old cliche goes, Russia stops fighting, then it goes back to Russia. Ukraine stops fighting, there's no more Ukraine. And that is underlined by the use of nuclear weapons. And then what happens if the Russians use nuclear weapons? Well, if you're in Japan, or you're in Pakistan, or you're in many other countries who have the ability to develop nuclear weapons who have not yet done so, will you think that nuclear weapons have been used, and so there's no reason why they might not be used again in the future? So you can see other countries doing that. Now, do you think China would be happy with that? So that puts us into a much more dangerous world for what would be, and I'm not a military strategist in the way that Hugh is, for what would be minimal gains on the battlefield would be appalling from a civilian casualties perspective, but for minimum gains. Now, also from the perspective, there is the perspective of public opinion and international relations. Now, we know that this is one of the few conflicts whereby it's very clear Ukraine has been invaded. But if you go to the global south and elsewhere, there's not the same level of support for Ukraine as maybe there should be. And I know that this is something your politicians and diplomats are working on. The moment Russia uses nuclear weapons, it loses what little it has left of that public support anywhere in the world.
But this maybe question will be for you. How important, like, some fears from Cold War plays there? Maybe you can explain why people in different countries are so afraid of using nuclear weapons.
An important distinction probably in this discussion between tactical nuclear weapons and what in the Cold War would have been called strategic nuclear weapons. And it's a distinction which, because we thought we had moved so far away from the era of nuclear deterrence, we forgot about. In the 1950s, it's important to remember, it was NATO armies in particular that thought tactical nuclear weapons might be useful because they saw them as battlefield weapons only. And they were conscious of their own numerical inferiority on the battlefield in comparison with the forces of the Soviet Union and what became the Warsaw Pact more generally. And in order to offset that, nuclear weapons were both important strategically to achieve deterrence in the first place. And then if it did come to war, the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons was very much on the table. We have moved away from that and the whole idea of tactical nuclear weapons. And so, to some extent, the invocation of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia has put us back into that context. And, of course, in this case, it's the Russians who are trying to cope with their inadequacies who are talking about tactical nuclear weapons. But what it would then have is consequences in terms of escalation, because actually in the minds of most people in NATO, and I suspect across the West as a whole, there is no valid distinction between these two, that actually you may want to use nuclear weapons in a battlefield context with a limited effect, but the reality is that you've embarked on a ladder of escalation which would ultimately end up in a much bigger nuclear exchange with much more, even more horrific consequences than you would start out with. And it's that worries those in the West who are concerned. And I think it's important here to remember President Biden's age. I mean, he is a child of the Cold War. And I think that's one of the reasons why he has been quick, or not as quick as Ukraine might have liked, but ready to support Ukraine in this context at a point at which the United States was looking towards China, or was more concerned about China. But he is sufficiently aware of the history of the US commitment to Europe and European security to see the importance of supporting Ukraine. But he's equally conscious as a result of that inheritance about the dangers of nuclear escalation and where that goes. And that has clearly affected his behavior at a number of points. In my own view, the position for NATO collectively and the United States specifically is that actually in some ways they have escalation dominance in this, because a use of nuclear weapons would itself be a reflection of Russia's weakness. And that would be crucially important. And I think, Stephen's already referred to China, but clearly if China is who after all has not actually been that supportive an ally, certainly not the level of support that NATO has given Ukraine, if China were outraged by the use of nuclear weapons, and it's one area where Xi was absolutely clear, then the consequences simply in terms of ostensible friends would be enormous. But it would also be enormous in terms of where Russia put itself in the wider global community.
Can I just talk about that whole idea of Russia's strategic aims here from an international perspective? And I think this is quite interesting. That builds on the nuclear point. We can't see inside the mind of Vladimir Putin, fortunately, for our own well-being. But let's for a moment think about some of the stated aims of Russia. And that was to bring Ukraine back within its orbit, even though Ukraine is independent and sovereign. But also it was to weaken NATO. Now, over the past few days, Finland has joined NATO, doubling NATO's border with Russia, doubling it. Sweden's about to join NATO. And what was really interesting, and I'm going to look at Sweden and Finland briefly, and we'll move back to Ukraine. But these were areas that would have been a red line for Russia previously. And actually, public opinion in Finland and Sweden switched from being fairly ambivalent about joining NATO to being fully behind, the public being fully behind joining NATO. I think the vote in the Finnish parliament, I can't remember, it was single figures, the number of MPs who actually voted against joining. At the same time, if you look at, so the strategic goal of weakening NATO has had quite the reverse effect. NATO is strengthened by Finnish and Swedish membership, given the capability, perspectives, all the benefits that we get by having those countries as members. And also in this perspective of trying to bring Ukraine within its orbit. Now, this isn't terribly scientific, but you walk around Kiev and it's one of the benefits of being here. This is a European city that's an outward-looking European city. And even those citizens, I suspect, who were sympathetic towards the Kremlin for whatever reason in the past, have seen the true face of Vladimir Putin's regime. And when we talked about nuclear weapons, well, what Ukraine is teaching us, and we know this, and I'm sure Sir Hugh will, as a historian, will tell us this, but Ukraine, not only do we know now but that Ukrainians will fight, but when the atrocities in Bucha, Irpin and other places were uncovered, this made Ukraine's necessity to fight all the stronger. So we see that these strategic, that, you know, as my colleague Professor Phillips O'Brien, who's joined us here, has said, Vladimir Putin must be the worst strategist in the world at the moment because all of his strategic goals have fallen away. NATO is being strengthened, Ukraine's resolve has been strengthened, and the international community's backing of Ukraine has been strengthened as well. Now, this doesn't come as particularly, I know that you've still got all the hard fighting to do, but it does tell us something about Russia's failure.
Yeah. And you mentioned NATO. This is one of my favorite topics within this war, because the alliance which was created to not to let the next war happen.
Yeah.
In situation when this war happened, disappeared somewhere. So EU is more active and more visual in their support. Some countries more active. We have Rammstein, actually, which substitute what NATO should do in this situation.
Yes.
And from one point of view, yes, there are senses behind what NATO is doing and not doing. But when they just like a reporting about non-lethal support, seriously, from the alliance, which is like a military-based alliance. So what's the future for NATO? Shall we rethink the NATO? Shall we rethink the security configuration in Europe at all? And how you see these developments, and what are your comments on this regard?
For me, there are twin pillars of European security for very, very different reasons. The twin pillars being NATO and the EU. Now, the EU is not military and does not have, but it provides us with, or those countries that have the good fortune to be in the EU, with the benefits of areas like food security, energy security, pooling your resources. And we also see, especially under Commission President von der Leyen, a very distinctive view in terms of the security role that the EU has to play, yes, in areas like food and energy, and bring the continent closer together to try and make war in Europe, the bits of Europe and the European Union, unthinkable. The EU was built as a peace project in the aftermath of the Second World War. In many ways, it's been the most successful peace project in the world. So you see that. So I think that the fact that Ukraine has, there seems to be some unanimity amongst policymakers that the future that people see here is one as EU citizens. You have something here that not many countries have, which is you have a very clear idea of where you see your country 10 years from now. I can't think of many other countries elsewhere in Europe whereby the citizenship, the political elites and others have a clear idea of where they see their countries 10 years from now. There's disagreement. So that on itself is that's very powerful. That unity of purpose that you have with many of your citizens. You'll disagree, and that's right. That makes your democracy stronger that you disagree with each other. But to have that goal is so important. And on the perspective of NATO, well, NATO's going to have to rethink what it's for as well. Now, I've been quite impressed with the way that NATO has held together during this process. And if you think on the other end of Europe in this war, and I just mentioned Finland and Sweden, The closest country to Scotland in many ways, where I come from, is Ireland. Now, Ireland has had a historic level of neutrality. Part of that's geography, part of it's history. They don't have Russia as a next-door neighbour. But even in Ireland, they're starting to debate and discuss membership of NATO. The debate is much further back at the moment, but as a direct consequence of this war. Now, if any international organisation is to be successful, it cannot stand still. The EU that the UK left 3 years ago is a different European Union from even that moment.
You're coming back?
I hope so. I mean, personally, I hope so. I'm very passionate pro-European. That's something that's on the record. I don't think I'm giving away too many secrets there. But I think that this, regardless of your views on whether or not the UK should be in or your views on NATO, that for these international organisations to be successful, they must constantly evolve. And they change because people change, because countries change. And Ukraine has changed NATO and it's changed the European Union, even though you're outside for the moment.
We're still thinking when it is possible to Ukraine to become a membership of the NATO.
Yes.
I think you need to think what NATO went through after the end of the Cold War, and then when it found itself in February 22. I mean, after the Cold War, NATO seriously questioned its reason for existence. I mean, it came into being because of the needs of European security. And I remember very clearly when the wall came down in Berlin, my father, who'd served in the Second World War, who studied German before the war, had a girlfriend in Germany before the war, who married during the war. And I found a letter after he died in which she said she'd been bombed out 3 times and she'd no idea whether her husband was still alive. He was a Russian prisoner of war. And they had, I think, 2 children. I mean, I've never met this woman, but the letter was there in his papers when he died. And I remember when the wall came down, he was crying. He said, I never thought I'd see a Europe that came back together again in the way in which it did. Now, that was good news at that point, but bad news for NATO in that it seemed as though its reason for existence had gone. And, you know, the big debate was, should NATO operate out of area? Which, of course, it did quite specifically in surprising ways in Afghanistan, though that happened for other reasons ultimately because of the 9/11 attacks. But the other consideration, of course, is if Europe was secure, then why should the United States commit itself to the security of Europe? Because actually, and particularly by the end of the first or into the second decade of the 21st century, they were looking back to the Pacific, to another area of interest and away from the North Atlantic. And, of course, the response to that, as Ukraine knows only too well, was that actually the decision was to make NATO more of a political alliance than a military alliance. So the accession of East European members following the collapse of the Soviet Union, of which, of course, Ukraine was not part, and that's precisely why we're sitting here now talking about this, but the accession of those countries then also expanded the geographical reach of NATO Europe. In other words, it wasn't just the West European countries. So we had a war in Afghanistan where the Poles, for example, were fighting principally because they wanted to be sure that if they were in trouble, America would come to their help. And I have to say, when in St. Andrews, I'm now losing track of years, but probably 3 or 4 years ago, we had lessons from Afghanistan for the NATO members and those who've been in Afghanistan. And the overwhelming response of all the European members was the reason they had gone to Afghanistan was to make sure that the US would be with them if there was a crisis closer to home. And what we've really seen is the acting out of that. I mean, from Ukraine's point of view, a massive failure of deterrence between 2014 and 2022. A lukewarm response when you were first invaded in 2014, and a complete failure in the run-up to February 2022, thinking that sanctions would be sufficient when there was no effective military guarantee. What we've seen since then is individual members, just as they recognize the value of having America as an ally if they were under threat, recognizing, therefore, the value of a support to Ukraine, the need to give support to Ukraine. Poland, again, is the most obvious example. And a more ambivalent response from much of Western Europe because of distance. The threat is not so immediate. America is crucial here, of course, in how it behaves. But since February 2022, the alliance has moved incrementally, slowly, behind the curve, but has been much more together. You're absolutely right. The European Union has had a better war than NATO has, certainly in the first stages. And I think one of the reasons for that, we were talking about Ursula von der Leyen before we came on air, and I remember going to a meeting in Berlin where we were talking about the new German White Book, Weißbuch, which was then under discussion. And it was a full-day session. Ursula von der Leyen was then defense minister. She came into the room, she welcomed us, and then we had a whole day's discussion, and she stayed and she listened. She didn't go away. If that had been a UK defense minister, they would have said welcome and then left the room. And I was enormously impressed. I mean, in other words, this is a president of the European Union who takes security as a crucial dimension of what the European Union should be doing. And we've seen that from her leadership, and we've seen that in many ways from the way in which the European Union collectively has rallied. It doesn't mean we've resolved all the problems in relation to the EU as a security institution, but at least a recognition of its importance. And it's worth bearing in mind, we've just been talking about Finland's accession to NATO. About the same time, I went to Finland because they were talking about hybrid warfare, which, as in Germany, was being discussed as a substitute for talking about Russia. And they were talking about hybrid warfare. And what she was saying, what Finland was saying at that point is our alliance is the European Union. I mean, they were seeing the European Union as a security alliance as well as an economic relationship. That was partly, of course, because they weren't in NATO for the reasons that we know. But it was at least a recognition that the EU gave some measure of security. We're now in a situation where at some point it is clearly going to be perfectly possible for Ukraine to be members of both the EU and NATO. And the question is not whether, but when, how long that process will take. The challenge for the membership, and the important thing to remember, is here is an alliance which proceeds essentially by consent. So it is an alliance of individual members. And one of the problems, I think, for NATO is that it's become an institution that is out to look after itself as an institution. And if you think about the Madrid conference last year, the focus there was on making NATO stronger. There was very little said actually about direct support for Ukraine. What will be the big test is the Vilnius conference, which is the next summit. But what is probably even more important is, are there individual NATO members, because they are still capable of taking their own decisions, are there individual members who are ready to commit themselves to the support of Ukraine? And there are. And you've seen elements, and of course it varies from state to state because they have different degrees of proximity, different degrees of identification with the issues that Ukraine is fighting for. But broadly speaking, that is there. And the situation is far better than it was before February. You'd like it to be faster, for sure. I entirely see that. And the issue is urgent. I absolutely see that. But it hasn't fallen apart. And what's happened, I think, is that actually we have got used to the idea that an alliance, because NATO is, in inverted commas, the most successful alliance in history, that's how it presents itself because it's existed for so long. What we forget is the functional alliances of the past, pre-NATO, were those that came together because of shared interests in time of war. And it's that tests the alliance. And we now have a situation where President Zelensky will go to Britain or to the United States, as he's done, and talk about our allies. And we will reciprocate by talking about ourselves as allies. It is events making that possible. It is war itself that's making that possible. So although I think you might be tempted to despair of NATO, it's sort of the usual standard about alliances, better hold on to the hand of nurse or mother rather than the fear of something worse. And I think that there is the possibility out of war. NATO, after all, was a product of a post-war arrangement for something better to occur. But that doesn't get you there tomorrow. Certainly doesn't get you there today.
Yeah, we do understand that, and I absolutely agree that it's much better than it was a year ago. But even in terms of weapons, for example, of course, we very grateful to all our allies that we received these weapons last year. But at the same time, we still don't have long-range missiles, for example. We still have this battle for jets, F-16, for example. Why is it possible? Why is it still possible that we don't receive this weapon, critical weapon for Ukraine? And what else we can do just to receive those weapons as soon as possible?
I think Ukraine has made its needs and demands very clear. And I think anybody with any military understanding understands the urgency of those demands and exactly where they would fit into the equation. The challenge, again, is the challenge in part of democratic politics. In other words, you have a president in the United States who is facing the end of his term and the possibility of an election with a Republican Party that might be much more isolationist than a Democratic Party would be, and therefore how that story will play out. Broadly speaking, there's been more bipartisan consensus in the United States than many might have expected between Republicans and Democrats. So I think that the story is not entirely negative, but I think a big constraint has been domestic as far as the president's concerned. I think for the other allies who are closer, if you like, to the danger, because they're in Europe, they've actually disarmed to the point where they find it very hard to rearm quickly. I mean, there is a real issue. It's not just the sophisticated equipment like F-16s and long-range missiles. It's issues like shell supply. As a First World War historian, by the winter of 1914-15, the issue of a shell shortage was universal across all fronts because no state was sufficiently mobilized for a major conflict fought over a protracted period to be able to give enough shells to the guns without industrial conversion and development. Most European countries, all European countries, are not in a position quickly to respond. And yet shells are something which are much more basic and much more urgent, or as urgent as anything to do with F-16s and guided missiles. There is a further problem, of course, which is the fear of escalation, which we've already talked about in relation to nuclear weapons. That, in other words, if you produce long-range weapons, that this may provoke Russia because you'll actually be striking Russian soil. I think that fear is exaggerated, precisely for the reasons I've already said, that Russia's in a position of weakness.
We already do this.
Yeah, Steve,
Can I just, you picked up on something quite important there, which we've been discussing during our time here. Now, my background is more in politics, but Hugh touched upon this, and in terms of the weapons, is a very, very, very good point. There is more to war, as you know, than the armaments, and a big part of that war is the information war. A big part of that war is the cyber war, all these other areas. Whether we like it or not, the communication effort is incredibly important. And actually, when you touched upon this question, Ukraine has challenges. We know this, which is how do you maintain support for Ukraine when, I was in politics. Who's your boss in politics? Your boss are the people who elected you, your constituents. So how do we maintain support for Ukraine, and how do we build support for these armaments? Now, in some ways, it's easier in the East because if you live in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, like Ukraine, you have lived with this existential threat. I remember this debate coming up that the Lithuanian health commissioner was born in a gulag. And like Ukraine, for Lithuanians, Latvians, even Finns, this is Poles, this is not ancient history, this is living history. So this is really important. I think one of the effective things that you've been doing, for example, are sending out some of your members of parliament and others to really make the case. I don't know which political parties they all come from. It's not for me to say, I hope people in Ukraine will continue to use their democratic rights and vote however they see fit. That's not for me to say. But I'll say this, of all the MPs that I've come across, they are passionate advocates for, passionate and articulate advocates for Ukraine. Please keep sending them to different countries. People like Lasia Vasylenko, who's an old friend, or Andrei Shavchenko, who's an old friend. I know he's not a member of parliament anymore. Maria Mezentseeva, Dmytro Natoluka. These people have come out, and I know it's from cross-party, and they're making the case. And it's not somebody like me saying, I was in Ukraine and these were my experiences. It's somebody saying, I live in Ukraine. My family are in danger. This is what's going on. It's so powerful. And it helps to move on this debate about armaments, about F-16s, by actually being powerful advocates and illustrating. So that political debate and inserting yourself into the political debate in different countries becomes a really important part of the overall war effort.
Agree. But at the same time, if we're speaking about the changes and the nations and governments, my feeling during this year was that the nations were ahead of the governments. That many nations, for example, like Germans, yes, they were supporting, but the government, they were just losing time for some period.
Look, in democratic societies, the governments that are too far behind the people don't last very long. That is the nature of a democratic society. So, governments that are behind public opinion don't tend to last. But there is a serious point, and I want to, again, are you using the Ukrainian diaspora most effectively? In places like the United States, not all decisions are made in Washington. Decisions are made in states. I mean, it's the same in politics anywhere. In the United Kingdom, our constituencies are incredibly important. The same in France, the same in Germany. So the debates cannot and will not just take place in these capital cities.
Okay, saying about this, that people influence the government.
Yeah.
What changes we can see after this war in Europe and in geopolitics? Because first of all, in my opinion, Ukraine brought the straightforward manner of the diplomatic work. Mm-hmm. Yes, it was like we did it because we needed. We didn't have time for, some kind of political wording. But that became quite popular, and looks like people are hungry for this, for such a manner of the decision making, for such a manner of diplomatic efforts. Look now at UN. This is like Russia is now leading Security Council,
sure,
which is the big joke of everything. And some nations already starting to speak that we don't want to bear it anymore. So what changes will happen? Whether we will see in the nearest years the change in UN, the change in decision making in EU, what do you feel?
Well, let's bring it close to home first of all.
Mm-hmm.
There are already changes in the European Union and in European policy. So already we've talked about, you and I have both brought up Ursula von der Leyen and the changing nature of the European Union, and the fact that even though the UK only left the EU 3 years ago, if it were to join tomorrow, it would be joining almost an entirely different organisation from the one it left. That's healthy. That shows that the EU is able to move. So Ukraine is having an impact way beyond its borders. I think, as I said to the press yesterday, Ukraine sits on the front line of democracy and the rule of law in Europe, and I think that's recognised, and you're right to talk about public opinion. Also, when we talk about Europe, and I'm just focusing in on Europe for a moment because I think it's so important, we've traditionally thought, and I think wrongly, about European decision-making and the importance of politicians in Berlin, Paris and London. Well, increasingly, we're seeing the importance of politicians and political movers and shakers in places like Warsaw, Vilnius, Helsinki, Sofia, Kiev, and elsewhere. Of course it is. And this has an impact outside our borders. Now, the UN will have to change because the UN was formed in a 1945 international environment that no longer exists. The 1945 consensus is now almost a century old. Almost, not quite. But this tells us something about the way in which we will... What Ukraine is doing is prompting a debate. And I know that you're saying that we're at war, we don't need a debate, but actually this is the way that you move things forward.
I think the UN issue is actually the most important of them all, quite frankly, because, obviously the accusation, the principal accusation against Russia is it fought a war of aggression. Which is the most basic principle of the UN Charter. And the UN has proved powerless in its response to it. And that powerlessness has long been flagged up. It's been growing for some time, partly for the reason that Stephen's already mentioned, that it reflects a 1945 order, which is no longer the order that should be shaping the world, but partly also because the principal architect of that order, the United States, stepped back from the United Nations. Even in Britain, when it came to the conflict in Libya, the British Prime Minister of the day, David Cameron, expressed his impatience with the United Nations. And the accusation from China was that when the United Kingdom in that case and France and the United States got a UN Security Council resolution, they exceeded the remit they had been given and therefore by themselves managed to undermine the instrument they were using. And I think what I find most depressing is that you have a Security Council which clearly is in a position where it can do nothing, and a General Assembly which, at least in terms of the majority of states, has expressed its opinion, and the General Assembly is unable to take executive action over the head of the Security Council. And the need to find an international law or mechanism for the UN to address that. So essentially what you'd be putting in place, you may say it would protract the debate, it would make it more complicated, but the ability to have essentially a bicameral system so that you would be in a situation where the majority could at least express a view in relation to the minority. The United States is never going to agree to that. So actually the obstacle here is as much the United States as it is the Soviet Union. As it was, and Russia as it is today. In some respects, of course, what is striking, if you look back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that faced with a major threat, in the end, both the United States and the Soviet Union in the context of 1962 stepped back. So we're aware of that danger. I don't have an instant solution to that any more than anyone else in the world does, because, of course, one of the challenges is that the UN came out of the worst war that the world had ever seen, the Second World War. So the sense of urgency was great. The sense of urgency is great in relation to Ukraine, but it's self-evident that if we talk about it globally, there is an enormous growth in what we used to call the non-aligned movement. People who say, this is a problem in Europe, not a problem for us. That concerns Ukraine. It concerns many European countries, that actually the values that they think are at stake here are not ones that many states and many very populous states with large populations see as so important that they have to assert themselves. But I think that is, that wider global dimension is central to this argument.
I have a question. Mm-hmm. It will be about peaceful process. So you mentioned about 1962, like the US and Soviet Union. So do you still believe that peaceful process is possible?
At the moment, peaceful processes are not possible. On the other hand, if we want a peaceful world, they have to become possible at some point. And I think the real challenge that this war presents for Ukraine and for the wider international community is precisely that challenge, how you move from war to peace. It is far easier, it's an old cliche, it's far easier to go to war than it is to bring about a peace settlement. And as I've already said, I worked predominantly on the First World War. The peace settlement between 1918 and 1923 was botched. It failed to bring a lasting international order, although many of the ambitions that we would recognize, at least voiced by the then US President Woodrow Wilson, were ambitions that we would continue to support. The idea of national self-determination, the idea that essentially there is more likely to be a peaceful international order if countries are democracies, all that sort of set of principles was laid out then. It was ambitious in terms of its agenda, and in many respects, the United States in particular has never departed from that agenda. But the challenge now is, how do you move beyond war to a situation where, particularly when Ukraine and Russia are direct territorial neighbors, where you have an order which will be sustainable between the two countries? And the short answer is, given how things currently are, and Ukraine recognizes this perfectly well, you will only get to that point at this stage by fighting. It will come through military decision-making. What you don't want to find, and I know in Ukraine you don't want to find, is a negotiation that freezes a conflict, that still has the capacity to reignite. That is not in your interest, self-evidently. It's not in the interests of most other European countries who are entirely behind you in that sentiment. And it's not in the interests of most Europeans who would see that too.
It's also an old Russian tactic as well. I mean, I spent time working in Georgia. You go to Georgia, you go to Moldova, Ukraine has almost been a decade of this kind of what wasn't quite a frozen conflict, but this is Hugh's quite right. This is one of Putin's oldest tactics over this time.
But the question, I mean, the much bigger question, and I've heard it in the 2-3 days I've been here, is the expectation. Which side of the expectation you come? Is Russia about to implode, to collapse? Or is it, on the other hand, a state which will continue to exist, with whom you have to have a relationship? And that's a big choice. And it's not entirely obviously in your hands. But if you achieve the victory you hope for, then that is the discussion you've got to address, because you then have to think, how do you manage that post-war relationship?
Okay, but we are going to address and to raise this question, obviously. But what happened in the Second World War? Then the decision about the future Germany was made by coalition. And here we also have coalition. Yes, we don't have so many soldiers from other countries fighting with us, but we do have a coalition with the countries who support us, who supply the weapons. And I think that Western countries need to start this discussion among them, how we see the future Russia, because not only Ukraine will be sitting on this negotiation table. Yes, obviously we will manage this deal, but we have Georgia, we have Moldova, we have Poland, we have Finland, we have Japan, and we have interests of Europe who is suffering many, many years from Russian aggressiveness.
I would agree, absolutely. And it seems to me to say it is for Ukraine to take this decision. It's Ukraine's war. It's Ukraine who must define what victory is actually to some extent an abdication of responsibility. If you commit forces, which self-evidently your supporters have, you're also buying into that decision. And you need to recognize, therefore, you have responsibility. I mean, if I had to produce a single criticism of US's conduct of the war, of any war, since Vietnam, it would be that they think they can limit a war by limiting the means they use without effect, and that will in turn shape the outcome, but without a clear understanding of what that outcome will be. And very often expressing it in very open-ended terms. So when, for example, President Zelensky went to the United States, the rhetoric from both him and President Biden was we're fighting a war for democracy, a war for freedom. That's fine. And clearly that is what's going on. But on the other hand, that is not the hard graft of understanding what a peace settlement would look like. How do you actually transfer those ambitions into something that makes sense on the ground? Because, what began this in part is a war of much older concepts like empire and frontiers and territory. So you need to bridge the division between words which mean different things to different people. We could have had a discussion for the last 45 minutes about what democracy might mean or what freedom means, because each state will understand those things in different terms. When it comes to decide where a border comes, that's a different undertaking.
Probably this is a good point to stop. We can speak hours and hours more. And I hope this is not your last visit. And I hope that you will also influence the decision-making in UK and in other countries. And I do wish that whole Europe will renovate itself through this war, because we're paying too high price for all this. And we are ready to fight for democracy, but democracy also should fight for us.
You're right. And we've got lessons that we badly need to take out of this as a society and as a country ourselves.
Thank you so much for your support, and thank you for this
Thank
talk.
you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure to be in Ukraine, even in the most difficult circumstances.
Absolutely.
So thank you for being with us. Just to remind you that we produced this podcast jointly with the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. My name is Alina Frolova, and I'm grateful for you to follow our podcast Safe, Unsafe Country. And I will be pleased to welcome you on the next episodes. So please follow us on the biggest podcast platforms like Google, Apple, Spotify, and of course resources of Ukrainska Pravda.